Have you ever lost something important because you couldn't forgive? This is the story of two brothers who are separated because of an old wound. However, one of them is on the verge of bankruptcy, but doesn't realize that forgiveness is the key to his freedom. How many times have you wondered why your life seems stuck, like something is holding you back from moving forward? Maybe what you haven't realized yet is that forgiveness, or rather, the lack of it, could be exactly what's keeping you trapped. It might seem strange to think that the key to freedom lies in something so counterintuitive, right? After all, why forgive someone who hurt you so deeply? But the truth, as hard as it may be to accept, is that forgiveness isn't for the person who wronged you, it's for you. Forgiveness is a gift you give yourself, a way to break free from the invisible chains that tie you to the past. And you know what's even more surprising? Forgiving doesn't have to be a long process. With the right mindset, that freedom can happen much faster than you might think. Curious to find out how? The beginning of the conflict. Mark and John had always been close, but like in many families, conflict wasn't far off when more serious matters came into play. It all started with the inheritance their father left behind, a sensitive topic in any family. Their father, thinking he was doing the right thing, divided the assets differently between the two sons. Mark got the family farm, while John received a sum of money. At first glance, it seemed fair, but John didn't see it that way. To him, the farm was a symbol of security and family continuity, something he believed should also be his. And so, the conflict began. During a simple conversation between them, what was a small spark turned into a wildfire. Words that should have calmed the situation only fueled the flames. John felt like Mark had always been favored in their father's decisions, and that old wound now felt more visible than ever. "You always thought you were the favorite, didn't you?" John snapped, angrily, words loaded with unresolved emotions. Naturally, Mark, hearing this, felt attacked, as if the argument was no longer about the inheritance but about a lifetime of built-up resentments. What followed was a cycle of accusations that only fed their pride. Mark, with a cold tone, tried to justify that their father's decision was logical. After all, he had always managed the business, and it made sense for the farm to be in his hands. But John, not understanding the subtleties of this choice, only saw the loss of something he believed was rightfully his. Pride took over, and what could have been resolved through conversation became an unbreakable barrier between the two brothers. John, feeling wronged, slammed the door of Mark's house, vowing never to return. That moment was a turning point. What was once a brotherly bond had now turned into an open wound, hard to heal. Both of their prides grew stronger with each passing day, and with every thought, the hurt and frustration deepened. John carried the pain of a life he believed could have been different. Mark, on the other hand, moved forward with his life, but always with the bitter feeling of having lost a brother. The inheritance, which should have brought the family together, was the spark that tore them apart. Now, the two went their separate ways, but they shared something in common. Both were imprisoned by the invisible chains of pride. John, with his heart heavy with resentment, and Mark, focused on success, but always with the sense that something essential had been broken in his life. The distance between them seemed irreversible, but as always, fate had an unexpected twist in store. The consequences of pride. Pride is a dangerous feeling, capable of eroding even the strongest of relationships. For Mark and John, this feeling had turned into an impenetrable wall. As the years passed, neither dared to take the first step toward reconciliation. Mark, although very successful, began to face financial difficulties. His investments, once sure bets, started to crumble amidst the market crisis. It was as if everything he had built was about to fall apart. Still, pride kept him from asking for help. He believed he could handle everything on his own, holding firmly to his idea of self-sufficiency. On the other side, John watched his brother's downfall from a distance. To him, each piece of news about Mark's struggles felt like a relief. "He's paying for everything he did," John thought, without any regret for his thoughts. The resentment he harbored had turned into a kind of cruel satisfaction. Every failure of Mark's was seen as a victory for John, but this momentary sense of revenge only poisoned his soul even more. Deep down, what John didn't realize was that his own pride was trapping him in an emotional prison where he found no peace, not even in the small joys of life. John's simple and modest life was constantly overshadowed by the bitterness he felt. He couldn't look to the future without thinking about the past. His relationships with others also began to suffer, as the resentment spilled over into his daily actions. John became more withdrawn, more bitter, and less willing to let anyone get close to him. Pride, like a shadow, followed his every step, preventing him from moving forward and reaching the peace he so deeply desired, even without knowing it. Meanwhile, Mark sank deeper into debt, watching his empire crumble. The brother who had always been the stronger one now found himself vulnerable, but pride still dominated him. Asking for help was out of the question, and this led him into a spiral of self-destruction. His confidence turned into despair, but he hid it behind a facade of success. Many still saw him from the outside as the same successful businessman, but inside he was falling apart. Yet, something stopped him from breaking that barrier and asking for help from the only brother who, somewhere, might still reach out. This cycle of pride and resentment between the two brothers seemed endless. Each day, the distance between them grew, and the emotional weight became harder to bear. Neither wanted to give in, neither wanted to appear weak. Yet both were suffering the consequences of this choice, even if in different ways. Fate, however, still had something in store for these two brothers, something they couldn't foresee that would completely change the course of their lives. God's call to forgive. On what seemed like an ordinary day, John decided to go to church, not knowing that something profound was about to happen in his heart. The sermon that Sunday was about forgiveness, and the pastor spoke with a conviction that pierced through the barriers of John's pride. "Forgiving is not a choice, it's a command," the pastor said, quoting Matthew 18 verses 21 to 22. John, sitting in the back, felt something different. It was as if every word was directed at him, as if God himself was speaking directly to his heart. Although he wanted to resist, he knew that moment wasn't a coincidence. In the days that followed, the message of that sermon kept echoing in John's mind. He found himself thinking about Mark, remembering everything that had happened, but also reflecting on what the pastor had said. Forgiveness doesn't just free the other person, it frees the one who forgives as well. This idea was uncomfortable for John. He had held on to so much bitterness that now forgiving seemed almost impossible. How could he forgive Mark after so many years of built-up hurt? The internal struggle between pride and the desire for peace began to consume his thoughts. As he prayed, John felt that God was pushing him to take action. He knew that forgiving Mark was the right path, but he still felt trapped by the past. Every time he tried to take the first step, resentment resurfaced, like an anchor holding him back. But God's voice, soft and persistent, continued to echo in his soul. John began to realize that forgiveness wasn't about deserving, but about freedom. He didn't need to wait for Mark to repent to forgive him. Forgiveness was a gift he could give to himself. John started practicing small acts of forgiveness in his daily life, as a way to prepare for the bigger moment. He forgave minor offenses, reconnected with old friends, and little by little, the burden he carried began to lighten. The pride that once imprisoned him was losing its grip. What he didn't realize, though, was that each of these small steps was preparing him for the great act of forgiveness that was yet to come. Every day, John felt peace drawing closer, but he also knew that the biggest challenge was still ahead: forgiving his brother. God's call was clear, but John knew that answering it would require immense courage. The wound was still there, open, and pride continued to whisper that he should stand his ground. But something stronger, something divine, was beginning to win this internal battle. John knew that God was by his side, and that with divine help, he could take the step that would change his life forever. The emotional reunion of the brothers. After months of prayer and reflection, John finally made the decision. He knew that forgiveness could no longer be delayed. With a heart full of anxiety but also hope, he packed his bags and set off for the city where Mark lived. During the trip, his mind was constantly racing, replaying every argument, every bitter word exchanged between them. Doubt still haunted him. Am I doing the right thing? Will Mark even listen to me? But something stronger than fear was driving him, and he knew he couldn't turn back. When he reached Mark's door, John felt a tightness in his chest. His hand hesitated before ringing the doorbell. In that moment, all the years of silence between them seemed to weigh heavily on his shoulders. He thought about leaving, about giving up, but the voice of God that had guided him every step of the way wouldn't let him. He knew this wasn't about Mark anymore. It was about his own freedom. With a deep breath, John rang the doorbell and waited, his heart pounding in his chest. Mark opened the door, and the man John saw standing before him was unrecognizable. The strong, confident, and successful brother from before was now just a shadow of who he used to be. His eyes, which once shone with pride, were now dull and tired. When they looked at each other, the silence spoke louder than any words. Mark tried to speak, but his voice failed him. He simply couldn't believe John was standing there, right in front of him. The weight of past hurts showed in the tears filling both of their eyes. John took a step forward and, without saying a word, embraced his brother. It was a heavy embrace, full of unspoken emotions, of forgiveness and regret. Both cried, feeling the burden of pride and pain begin to melt away. John, his voice trembling, said, "I forgive you, Mark." They were simple words, but they carried the weight of years of suffering. Mark, sobbing, replied, "I don't deserve your forgiveness, after everything that happened." But John, holding his brother tighter, said, "It's not about deserving. Neither of us deserves it. It's about moving forward." That embrace marked the beginning of a new chapter in the lives of the two brothers. What once seemed impossible was now unfolding before their eyes. The power of forgiveness, something John had learned the hard way, was transforming their lives. In that moment, the hurts of the past no longer mattered. All that remained was the feeling of relief, of renewal. They knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but together, they had the chance to start over. The transformation after forgiveness. From that embrace, something profound changed in both of their lives. Mark, who had been overwhelmed by financial struggles and loneliness, felt a new hope arise. John's forgiveness was like a balm for his wounds, allowing him to see his situation differently. Although his financial problems weren't solved instantly, he now had the strength to start again. The feeling that everything was lost gave way to a new determination. Mark realized that true success wasn't found in his material achievements but in the restoration of his relationship with his brother. For John, forgiveness brought an inner peace he hadn't experienced in years. The weight of the bitterness and pain he had carried was finally lifted. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he could breathe freely. The transformation that forgiveness brought to his life was so tangible that even his relationships with others began to improve. He became more open, more compassionate, and more willing to listen. John understood that by forgiving Mark, he had not only freed his brother, but had also freed himself from the invisible chains of pride. As the days passed, the two brothers began to rebuild the relationship they had lost. It wasn't a quick process, but forgiveness was the foundation that made this rebuilding possible. They started spending more time together, reminiscing about the good times from their childhood, but also creating new memories. Mark, with John's help, began to reorganize his financial life. John, in turn, learned that Mark's success didn't diminish his own worth. On the contrary, together, they could achieve much more than they ever could alone. The transformation that forgiveness brought to Mark was also remarkable. He, who had once been driven by unchecked ambition, began to see life from a new perspective. He understood that he couldn't solve all of his problems on his own, and that sometimes true strength lies in accepting help. With John's support, Mark began to rebuild his empire, but this time with a more solid foundation. He not only regained his confidence but also strengthened the bond with his brother, creating a new partnership. The journey of forgiveness and reconciliation wasn't easy for either of them, but it was essential for their transformation. What had once been a relationship destroyed by pride and pain was now a bond strengthened by love and respect. Both came out of this experience renewed, ready to face life's challenges differently. Mark and John learned that forgiveness isn't just an act of kindness. It's a key that opens the doors to a fuller and more meaningful life. Now that you understand the transformative power of forgiveness, the question that remains is, what's still holding you back from taking that step? Is it really worth staying stuck in the past, letting pride and hurt block your peace? Think about it. Who is really suffering the most from this pain? Forgiveness is the key that's in your hands, ready to set you free and open doors to a lighter life. What if today was the day you decided to forgive and finally move forward? Imagine how different your life could be. What's holding you back might be the only thing standing between you and the peace you haven't felt in a long time. If this message touched you and made you reflect, I invite you to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. This way, you can keep learning how to apply these teachings in your daily life and live more fully. Don't miss the chance to continue this journey of transformation.